For every 10,000 humans who struggled to survive on the prehistoric African savanna, the statistical probability of seeing someone with gray hair and wrinkled skin was effectively 0.001%. For the vast majority of our evolutionary history, old age wasn't a phase of life. It was a statistical impossibility. We were a species of the young, the fast, and the dead, in a world where a broken leg was a death sentence and a predator lurked in every shadow. The elderly were essentially non-existent. But then, something shifted that defies every law of natural selection. We started keeping our old people alive, even when they could no longer hunt, gather, or defend the group. Why did our ancestors choose to share their most precious, scarce resources with individuals who, on paper, were a physical burden? Was there a hidden biological profit in keeping the unproductive around, or was it something much stranger? If the goal of life is to pass on genes and move as fast as possible, why did we decide to slow down for the sake of the elderly? If we want to understand when this change happened, we have to look at a specific skull found in the Republic of Georgia, at a site called Dmanisi. This individual, known to researchers as D3444, lived roughly 1.8 million years ago. He is famous in the world of paleoanthropology because his jawbone tells a story of extreme vulnerability. When his skull was unearthed, scientists realized he had lost nearly all of his teeth long before he died. In a world without blenders, soft foods, or modern medicine, a toothless human is a dead human. Yet the bone of his jaw had completely resorbed, which is a process that takes years of surviving without teeth. This means that for a significant portion of his life, his tribe was processing his food for him, perhaps mashing it by hand or pre-chewing it, and protecting him from the harsh Caucasian winters. But if survival was a zero-sum game, why did they share the most precious resource? Could there be a reason why a toothless elderly man was considered more valuable than the calories it took to keep him alive? This leads us to a fascinating investigation conducted by anthropologists Rachel Kaspari and Sang-Hee Lee. They wanted to know exactly when old age became a common human experience. By analyzing the wear on the teeth of over 700 fossilized remains spanning millions of years, they calculated something called the OY ratio, the proportion of older adults to younger adults in a population. For millions of years, that ratio was abysmal. Then, around 30,000 years ago during the Upper Paleolithic, the number of people surviving into old age didn't just grow, it exploded. It increased by a factor of 5. This grandparent explosion happened at the exact same moment our species experienced a massive leap in cultural complexity, art, and tool-making. But if older people were physically slower and more prone to injury, what did they offer that was worth 5 times the burden? Could their presence actually have been the catalyst for human civilization itself? The answer might lie in what researchers call the library of the mind. In a world before writing, there was no way to store information outside of a human brain. If you were a 20-year-old hunter, your knowledge was limited to what you had seen in your 20 years. But if you had a 60-year-old in your tribe, you had access to 3 lifetimes of data. This wasn't just trivia, it was life-saving intelligence. We see the modern equivalent of this in studies of the Aboriginal peoples of Australia. During extreme, once-in-a-century droughts, the survival of a group often depended entirely on the memory of the oldest member. They were the only ones who remembered the location of a hidden soak or a permanent waterhole that hadn't been visited in 40 years. Without that single elderly person's memory, the entire tribe would have perished. Does this mean that the elderly weren't a burden at all, but were actually the primary survival technology of our species? If knowledge was the currency, then the elderly were the central bank. Think about the complexity of identifying medicinal plants. A single forest can contain thousands of species, many of which look identical but range from life-saving to lethal. An elder who has spent 50 years observing the effects of these plants is essentially a living medical encyclopedia. They knew how to track the movements of migratory herds during weird weather patterns that only happened once every few decades. They knew the nuances of flint knapping and the exact angle required to strike a core to produce a perfect blade, a skill that takes years to master. When an elder died in a pre-literate society, it wasn't just a personal loss. It was as if the group's only library had burned to the ground. But if information was the only value they provided, why would evolution create a biological mechanism specifically to keep them around? Is it possible our bodies were physically redesigned for the sake of the group? This brings us to one of the most provocative ideas in biology, the grandmother hypothesis. In almost every other mammal species, females reproduce until they die. Humans are a bizarre exception. We are one of the only species on Earth where females live for decades after they can no longer have children. From a cold evolutionary perspective, this seems like a mistake. Why would nature keep a body alive if it can't produce more offspring? Anthropologist Kristen Hawkes studied the Hadza people of Tanzania and found a startling pattern. The most productive foragers in the group weren't the young men or the nursing mothers. They were the grandmothers. These women spent more hours a day gathering calorie-dense tubers than anyone else. Because they weren't occupied with their own infants, they could funnel those calories to their grandchildren. This grandmother effect meant that the grandchildren were more likely to survive, and the daughters were able to have more children sooner. But if this was so effective, why don't we see it in other primates? Why did humans alone take this path toward a long, post-reproductive life? To find a comparison, we have to look away from the land and into the ocean. Orcas are one of the only other species that go through menopause. Researchers from the Center for Whale Research found that post-reproductive female orcas are the primary leaders of their pods, especially during lean years when salmon are scarce. These elder whales have the deep-sea memory required to find food when the usual spots fail. When a grandmother orca dies, the mortality rate for her grandsons increases eightfold in the following year. This suggests that the value of an elder isn't just about gathering food, it's about the targeted distribution of survival wisdom. In humans, this biological investment in grandmothers was so successful that it likely drove the evolution of our long lifespans. We didn't just happen to live longer. We evolved to live longer because the presence of an elder was such a massive survival advantage. But did this advantage extend beyond just finding food? Could the elderly have actually been responsible for the way our very brains developed? While the grandmothers were providing calories, the grandfathers and other elders were providing a different kind of social glue. In a small tribe, conflict is constant. The presence of a third generation, individuals who are not directly competing for mates or primary resources, acts as a stabilizing force. They are the mediators, the storytellers, and the keepers of the group's history. This social stability allowed human groups to grow larger. When a group grows larger, it can specialize. You can have one person who is incredible at making spears and another who is a master of weaving, rather than everyone trying to do everything. This specialization is the foundation of human culture. But if the elderly were the secret to our social success, what happens when that social structure starts to break down? Is it possible that our modern world has fundamentally misunderstood the biological role of our elders? The physical evidence of this deep care is found throughout the archaeological record. At the Shanidar Cave in Iraq, researchers found a Neanderthal man who had lived to his late 40s, an extreme age for the time, despite having a crushed eye socket, a withered arm, and a serious leg injury. He couldn't have hunted, he couldn't have kept up with a moving group on his own, yet he lived for decades with these disabilities. This tells us that the impulse to care for the unproductive isn't a modern invention. It is a core part of what made us human in the first place. This was a deliberate choice made by people living on the edge of starvation. They chose to carry him. They chose to feed him. But if this empathy is so deeply rooted in our past, why does it feel like it's disappearing in the present? Have we reached a point where we believe we've outgrown our need for the elderly? One of the most incredible discoveries in recent years involves the genetics of aging. Scientists have been looking at a variant of the ApoE gene, which is involved in brain health and cholesterol transport. Most animals have a version that leads to rapid decline as they age. Humans, however, evolved variants like ApoE3 and ApoE2 that seem to protect the brain from the kind of inflammation and damage that would otherwise lead to dementia. Evolutionary biologist Pascal Gagnon suggests that this didn't happen by accident. We evolved protective genes for our brains specifically so that elders could stay mentally sharp long enough to pass on their knowledge. Evolution was literally fine-tuning our DNA to ensure the library of the mind didn't crash. But if our biology is designed to keep our elders sharp, why do we see such a high rate of cognitive decline in the modern world? Is there something about the way we live now that is at odds with our evolutionary design? The shift began with the invention of external memory. For millions of years, if you wanted to know something, you had to ask a person who knew it. But the moment we started scratching marks into clay tablets, the monopoly held by the elderly began to crumble. Information could now survive the death of the person who discovered it. With the printing press and eventually the internet, the library of the mind was replaced by a library of paper and silicon. For the first time in 2 million years, a 20-year-old could know more about the world than an 80-year-old simply by reading. We moved from a culture of veneration to a culture of information. But while we successfully outsourced our memory, did we lose something else in the process? Can a search engine ever truly replace the lived experience of someone who has survived 70 winters? This brings us to an uncomfortable reality about the modern experience of aging. In ancient times, the elderly were never lonely because they were never unnecessary. They were the center of the tribe's survival strategy. Today, we have solved the problem of keeping the elderly alive. Medicine can sustain the body for much longer than the savannah ever could, but we have struggled to keep them needed. We have created a world where the oldest people are often the most isolated because their primary traditional role, the storage of information, has been automated. We love our grandparents, but we no longer rely on them to tell us which plants are poisonous or where the water is hidden. But if the need was the very thing that kept the bond strong, what happens to that bond when the need vanishes? Are we inadvertently suffering from a lack of elder wisdom that our biology is still wired to receive? Think about the way we interact with technology today. It's the one area where the traditional roles have completely reversed. Throughout all of human history, the child sat at the feet of the elder to learn how the world worked. Now the elder sits at the table while the child explains how the phone works. This inversion of the knowledge flow is a brand new phenomenon in the history of life on Earth. It has happened in the blink of an eye, evolutionarily speaking. We have essentially stripped away the informational utility of the elderly, leaving only the emotional connection. But is emotional connection enough to sustain a role that was originally built on the bedrock of survival? Or are we seeing the beginning of a profound psychological crisis for a species that is designed to be guided by its oldest members? We often view the care of the elderly as a sign of progress, a luxury of a wealthy society. But the bones of Dmanisi and Shanidar prove that the exact opposite is true. Care for the elderly wasn't a luxury. It was a strategy. It was a cold-blooded, highly effective method for ensuring the survival of the next generation. We are the descendants of the tribes who kept their old people alive. The tribes who abandoned their elders were the ones who didn't remember where the water was during the drought. They were the ones who didn't know the cure for the infection. They were the ones who went extinct. Our very existence is proof that the burden of the elderly was actually the greatest investment we ever made. But if we stop making that investment, what does that mean for our future? Can a society continue to thrive if it forgets the value of the people who hold its history? The modern world has largely focused on fixing the problems of old age, treating the joints, the heart, and the eyes. But we haven't spent nearly as much time fixing the problem of irrelevance. In our rush to digitize everything, we've forgotten that there is a difference between information and wisdom. Information is knowing that a certain plant is medicinal. Wisdom is knowing the exact moment the wind shifts that tells you a storm is coming, or knowing how to calm a grieving parent, or understanding the patterns of human nature that only become visible after 70 years of observation. We have plenty of information, but we are increasingly starving for wisdom. If you had to choose between a library of books and a person who has actually lived through the history those books describe, which would truly help you survive a crisis? This leads us to a fundamental question about how we treat the elders in our own lives. If you knew that your grandmother's presence was the reason your ancestors survived a 1,000-year drought, would you look at her differently? If you realized that your grandfather's long life was a deliberate gift from evolution to ensure your own brain developed correctly, would you listen to his stories with more intensity? We are walking around with a biological inheritance that was bought and paid for by the calories of 1 million prehistoric grandmothers. They didn't just survive, they thrived in conditions we can barely imagine, specifically so they could pass their world on to us. What part of that ancient wisdom are we currently ignoring because it doesn't fit into a 24-hour news cycle or a social media feed? Perhaps the most startling part of this entire investigation is the realization that old age isn't a failure of the body. It's a specialized state of being. Evolution has worked for millions of years to perfect the human elder. It has tweaked our genes, adjusted our social structures, and even modified our metabolic rates just to ensure that some of us reach a point where we are no longer productive in the traditional sense, but essential in a higher sense. We are the only species that has turned the end of life into a masterclass in survival. But that masterclass only works if there are students willing to listen. If the chain of knowledge is broken, does the biological purpose of old age disappear with it? When you look at an older person today, it's easy to see the frailty, the slow gait, the trembling hand, the struggle with a remote control. But you're looking at a physical form that was once the most sophisticated survival tool on the planet. For 2 million years, that person was the only thing standing between a tribe and total extinction. They were the map, the doctor, and the god of their world. We have changed the world so that we no longer need their maps, but we haven't changed our DNA, which still expects to be guided by them. How much of our modern anxiety and lostness comes from the fact that we have silenced the very voices we evolved to follow? If you could travel back 1.8 million years to that cave in Georgia and meet the people who cared for that toothless man, what would they think of us? They were people who had nothing, no clothes, no permanent shelter, no guarantee of a next meal, and yet they found it within themselves to pre-chew the food of a man who could do nothing for them in return. They saw a value in him that we often struggle to see in our own elders today. They knew something we've forgotten. They knew that the weakest member of the group was actually the secret to the group's strength. Does our current definition of usefulness need to be completely rebuilt from the ground up? And if we did that, what would our society actually look like? As we look toward the future, with an aging population that is larger than ever before, we have a choice. We can continue to view the elderly as a problem to be managed, a demographic cliff or a strain on healthcare, or we can recognize them for what they truly are, the greatest untapped resource of wisdom in human history. We are living in a moment where the library of the mind is being closed and locked away, not because the information is gone, but because we've stopped checking out the books. What would happen if we started treating our elders not as people who are fading away, but as people who have finally reached the most important stage of their evolutionary purpose? Which of their stories are you letting go unheard right now? Think back to that toothless skull in Georgia, D3444. When researchers look at that bone today, they don't just see a fossil. They see a miracle of social cooperation. The jawbone is smooth, the tooth sockets entirely closed up by years of healing and bone regrowth. It is a physical record of 1,000 acts of mercy. It is proof that nearly 2 million years ago, someone sat by a fire and carefully prepared a meal for an old man who couldn't bite it himself. They didn't do it because they had to. They did it because they knew he was the only one who knew the way back home. That smooth, toothless bone is the definitive proof that we didn't become human by being the strongest or the fastest. We became human because we were the only species that realized the most valuable thing you can carry isn't food or a weapon, but the memory of someone who has already seen it all. In a world that is constantly moving faster, perhaps the most radical thing we can do is slow down and listen to the people who have already reached the finish line. After all, they are the only ones who know if the race was actually worth running. Does the way we treat our old people today reflect the same wisdom that allowed that toothless man to survive nearly 2 million years ago? Or have we become so fast that we finally outrun our own reason for surviving? The truth is that the elderly are not a burden to be carried. They are the bridge that connects us to our own resilience. Every wrinkle is a map of a disaster they survived, and every gray hair is a testament to a winter they conquered. We are built to need them, and they are built to be needed. The next time you see an older person struggling with the pace of the modern world, remember that they are a survivor of a much harsher one, a world where their presence was the only thing that kept us from the dark. We owe our lives to the fact that for millions of years, we refused to leave them behind. What will you do to ensure that the library in your own life doesn't burn down before you've had a chance to read its most important chapters? In the end, the story of human evolution isn't just about the survival of the fittest. It's about the survival of the wisest. We kept our old people alive because they were the ones who knew how to keep everyone else alive. And even now, in a world of screens and satellites, that hasn't actually changed. We still need to know how to navigate the droughts of the soul and the winters of the heart. And for those challenges, there is no search engine. There is only the person who has been there before. If you could ask that toothless man from Dmanisi one question about what it felt like to be cared for when the world said he should be dead, what do you think he would say? Would he tell you about the food, or would he tell you about the fire? The definitive proof of our humanity isn't found in our tools or our tall buildings. It's found in that smooth, toothless jawbone of a man who died 1.8 million years ago, kept alive by a tribe that refused to let him go. That resorbed bone, smoothed over by years of patient daily care, is a haunting reminder of a time when we knew exactly what mattered. It stands as a silent closing argument against every modern urge to prioritize speed over connection. We are here because they cared. The question is, who will be here because we did?